All right, so last week in chapter 12, we talked about managing benefits. And in chapter 13, we're going to talk about different benefit options or the kinds of benefits that organizations can provide employees. This chapter is not comprehensive, but it does provide some of the most common benefits that most organizations provide employees, especially much larger organizations. So we briefly talked about benefit costs last week. According to our book, in private industry, total compensation is about $33.23, of which 30% is benefits. That percentage is much higher for public institutions like universities or federal, state, or local government, where the benefits are a much higher proportion of pay, of total compensation. And part of that is because the government's really large, so they can get good benefits for a much cheaper price than maybe smaller, medium-sized businesses. But also part of it is that the wages and salaries that public workers make are usually much lower than they would make in the private sector if they for a job that required the same kind of education and background. So overall benefits add 42 cents on top of every dollar of wages and salaries, which means when we're thinking about managing costs in an organization, thinking about benefits, what you provide, how they're utilized, and how much they're costing does matter in making decisions around what you're going to provide your employees. Larger establishments are more likely than smaller ones to offer many types of benefits, as we talked about last week. And then the most costly benefits are insurance and legally required benefits. Unfortunately, for organizations, legally required benefits they can't get out of, but insurance is also a really big one that most employees are looking for because this is their work is the main way that most people get health insurance in the United States. So our first legally required benefit is workers' compensation. This is no-fault insurance that covers injuries and diseases that arise out of or while in the course of employment. So if you're working and you get sick or you're injured, this will help cover some of your costs for your compensation that you would be losing by not working, and also some of your medical care. If you accept workers' compensation, it does mean that you can't sue your employer for the illness or disease you got, even if they were the cause of that. So, in many states, if you don't accept workers' compensation, you leave the ability to sue your employer open. But that does mean you're not getting paid while you're sick or injured for lost compensation or for your medical costs. Workers' compensation costs have declined over time when we adjust it for the growth in employment, the fact that more people work now than maybe 50 years ago, but also the fact that wages haven't gone up as quickly as inflation or other costs. Workers' compensation is covered by states, not federal laws. So if you work in HR, you'll be working under state law around workers' compensation. And that means across different states, which also means if you have workers in different states, you have to be aware of the state laws in each of those states, that the size of the payout for claims can vary. And then some states also have second injury funds, which help supplement workers' compensation to pay some of that loss compensation and medical costs. So, of the amount that's paid by the employer, which all of this is paid by the employer, a third of that goes to premiums and two-thirds of it goes to worker benefits, which are those medical or cash benefits for lost wages. That's just an interesting fact, and a little bit different from some of the other benefits we'll talk about. The second legally required benefit we'll talk about is Social Security and Medicare. These are actually two different federal programs, but they're talked about in together because they operate in very similar ways. So Social Security pays when workers retire. That's how we most commonly talk about it. So when you reach a certain age, you can get a proportion of your Social Security payment. But you can also get Social Security should you become disabled, even if you're disabled before retirement age, or should an employee die, it replaces part of the earnings that their family lost. So their family gets some of their Social Security payments. The money comes from contributions that are made by workers, employers, and self-employed people during their working years. So right now, if you're working, you are paying into Social Security, and your employer is also paying into it, unless you're self-employed, in which case you're paying the full amount. And then that amount now is going to people who are currently taking Social Security. Medicare works very similarly. If you're working now, you're paying Medicare, as is your employer paying some part of your the Medicare costs, and then that money is going to people who are currently on Medicare. The Social Security tax is 7.65% for the employee and 7.65% for the employer. So total, the employee and employer pay 15.3%. If you're self-employed, you are your own employer. And so you're paying that entire 15.3% yourself. So this is where when you're self-employed, you have to manage your taxes much better than maybe a regular employee would, because you don't have an employer pulling that out of every paycheck for you. The Medicare tax is much, much lower. It's only 1.45% for an employee and 1.45% for the employer, for a total of 2.9%. And again, if you're self-employed, you'll pay that whole 2.9% yourself. There is, and I don't think the book mentions this, a high earner rate as well. And the amount changes where that high earner rate starts. It's somewhere, I think, around $200,000 right now. And that means above whatever that amount is, let's just say it's $200,000 right now. Every dollar you make above that, you'll be taxed an additional 0.9% on those earnings to add to the Medicare account. So this is actually one idea we have for Social Security, that there's actually a cap on Social Security at some amount. Above that amount, you're no longer taxed anymore. That we do something more like Medicare, where we do tax and we have an additional tax for people who make a lot of money to put more money into the Social Security account. The Social Security benefits fall into four categories. One is old age, retirement, or disability benefits. But we also can have benefits for dependents of retired or disabled workers, benefits for surviving family members of a deceased worker, or lump sum death payments. So the Social Security system covers more than retirement, even though that's the most common way that people draw their Social Security. The amount that you receive of Social Security is usually based on the amount you contributed during eligibility quarters. Our book doesn't go through what an eligibility quarter looks like, but if you Google, there's actually a video I show my other classes that explains this from the Social Security Administration. If you just Google this, you'll find they have some infographics that are actually really good at explaining what these eligibility quarters are and how much you have to make in a quarter for it to count for your Social Security. But the amount changes every few years, so that's why I don't include it here, because even the amount that would have been in the book, I think, is different from what it would be today. Your full retirement age increases with birth year. So I think for those of us born after sometime in the 1970s, I want to say our full retirement age is about 70. So to get your full amount for Social Security, you'd have to wait to start drawing Social Security until you're at that full retirement age, whatever that is for your birth year. The amount of benefits depends on your earnings history. So the more that you earn, the more you get out of Social Security, up to a point. You don't get like endless amounts of money because, again, not every dollar is taxed if you're a high earner for Social Security. And then the benefit is free from state taxes in most states and free from federal tax if you don't receive any other income but Social Security. Another legally required benefit our book talks about is unemployment insurance, and this is completely paid by the employer. And this is unemployment insurance is the payments you get if you're unemployed. This usually is to offset lost income during involuntary unemployment. So involuntary means that you didn't leave your job, but you were laid off, for example. It helps unemployed workers to find new jobs. And the idea here is that it allows you to have some basic income so you can spend your time looking for a new job in the area that you are have your expertise in or that you've been working in, instead of having to immediately go out and get a job that would quickly pay you some money so you can keep paying for your rent or your mortgage, food, clothing, and that sort of thing. It also provides an incentive for employers to stabilize employment because they're the ones paying for this. And it preserves investments in worker skills by providing that income during short-term layoffs and allowing workers to return to their employer. How much you get in unemployment insurance, like how much you get per month or per pay period from unemployment, differs by state, and also how long you can be on unemployment insurance differs by state. And because it's funded by your employer, it's actually charged against your most recent employer. It gives an incentive to employers to not have mass layoffs of employees, but also to help employees when there is a mass layoff to find a new job very quickly. Another legally required benefit is Family and Medical Leave Act, or what we just call FMLA. And FMLA allows eligible employees to receive unpaid leave, so they're not necessarily paid at all, for up to 12 weeks per year for a specified family or medical reason. And there's a list of these reasons, but it's usually to take care of a family member or yourself, or like if you adopt or foster a child, you can use FMLA to take care of that child for the first 3 months. Employees are guaranteed a same or comparable job upon their return when they take FMLA, but employees with less than a year of service or who work less than 25 hours per week, so are working part-time essentially, aren't usually covered by FMLA. This also applies to employers with 50 or more employees within a 75-mile radius. And the idea here is that by having someone out for 3 months, and even if they're not getting paid, that's still kind of a hole in the number of employees you really need to fully function. So to make this not so burdensome for smaller businesses, the government has only applied it to businesses with 50 or more workers within a 75-mile radius, where you might be able to have some other workers take over some of the work for an employee who might be taking FMLA. A really common thing in businesses that don't have much parental leave or don't have any parental leave, a very common way of using FMLA is for people who are having children or who are going to adopt or foster children to use their paid time off first, and then take FMLA for whatever amount of time they have saved up some wages or salary so that they can be covered for the few months or a few weeks that they won't be paid using FMLA. So it is used quite a bit by many families. Unfortunately, many organizations are starting to do parental leave where they pay some amount of your income while you're gone if you have a baby or adopt or foster a child. FMLA is used in other kinds of situations than more often now than it was when it was first passed. The next legally required benefit is what we call the Consolidated Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. No one calls it that. We call it COBRA in HR. And essentially what this does is it allows you to continue to be on your insurance plan that you had under your employer when you've left that employer. So it provides current and former employees with temporary extensions of health insurance when their coverage is lost to a qualifying event like a layoff. It can also be if you left your own job but don't have another job set up, or your new job may not have may let you be eligible for insurance immediately. So you might use COBRA to at least have insurance for a month or two until you're eligible. Employers can charge up to 102% of the premium for coverage. And your coverage usually is about 18 months, but it can go up to 36 months depending on what the qualifying event is. The 102% premium is the full cost the employer was paying and the employee was paying for this insurance. The premium is what the employer was paying. So you might have to pay that on top of whatever the employees usually pay. And then the 2% is like an administrative fee for helping to administer this plan for someone who's no longer an employee. This only applies to employers with 20 or more employees. Partially because smaller employers often don't even have insurance for their employees, so they can't provide COBRA. They may sometimes give payments to employees to go to the Affordable Care Act, go onto the portal and try to find their own insurance, and sometimes they don't provide any insurance at all. So again, when they were making the law, they were trying to think, how do we not burden really small businesses with how much this would cost to maintain these insurance plans for employees who are no longer even working with the employer. And then finally, we have the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, but we just call this HIPAA usually. HIPAA allows employees to have their medical information separated from their employment information. So employers can't use that information if it's not, if there's any negative medical information or future medical negative information, that they can't use it to make decisions around who they hire and what kinds of benefits they provide you. So it lessens an employer's ability to deny coverage for a pre-existing condition, which was a big problem before we had the Affordable Care Act, where many people were not eligible for insurance because they had a chronic condition, for example. It prohibits discrimination on the basis of health-related status. And in 2002, there were a bunch of new privacy provisions added to the compliance issues. Part of this is because electronic records were starting to become popular. Part of it is we were starting to understand better how this information was being used to deny employment. But for those of you working in HR, that means there's more enforcement now in HR than there was maybe 25 years ago. And then for IT, they often had to build these secure health information systems to separate the health information from employment information for employees. So that may be something that some of you have to deal with in HR.